2025 will likely be the first below average weather year in New York since 2014. Maybe not necessarily the coldest, but there's been a lot of factors that have contributed to, why 2025 is shaping up to be a below average weather year in New York. And I did compile the data, roughly compile the data. January was 2.5 degrees below average. February was 0.9 degrees below average. March was 4.1 degrees above average. April was 1.6 degrees above average. May was 0.9 degrees below average. June was 1.6 degrees above average. July was 2 degrees above average. August was 2.3 degrees below average. September was 1.4 degrees above average. October was 0.6 degrees above average. November fell 0.8 degrees below average. December right now is polling at 8.2 degrees below average and near historic levels, which I said that, is equating out to be a net of 4.5. So did I mess up on those calculations? Maybe a little bit. But I got a degree below normal, so my miscalculation probably didn't matter that much. As a matter of fact, we were in below average territory, even before December. And, from being honest, we probably would need December to be above average by a bit to not average below normal, just based on these previous 11 months. The reality is that March, April, June, July, September, October were above average of 6 months. The other 6 months are below average, and to a more extreme extent on average. Seeing as March was the only month that was significantly above average. Well, I guess also that in July. Whereas you had a lot of significantly cold months. And at this point, I think the damage has been done. December, I don't think can really get to above average territory. I get that today is going to be a big warm-up as temperatures, have finally broken into, I think, the 50s, or if not the 50s, the very high 40s. And we'll see temperatures soar up to the upper 50s tomorrow, possibly even hitting 60. But the polar vortex is going to come right back in and cause things to sort of level out below average. I see December finishing probably around 2.5 degrees below average if I had to guess. Could be wrong, but that's what I estimate, if not even a little bit more. Actually, probably will be more, just because, again, if December was near average the rest of the way, we'd still be 4.5 degrees below average. And is it going to be near average the rest of the way? That's tough to honestly tell at this point in time. Okay, hopefully this video gets views. And I'll do this more in depth in the 2025 weather review video, just so you know. So in case nobody watches this video, maybe people watch that video. But anyway, as far as the weather for 2025 goes, why is this happening? And again, I'm just going to try not to waste too much time because I don't have that much time. But January was a persistently cold month. The warmest temperature month was just 51 degrees, and the warmest low temperature month was 39 degrees. January 1st showed signs of warmth, and January 2nd was still above average, but by January 3rd, it was obvious that the cold weather had taken its footing, and that would continue for a while. There would be some warm-ups like January 10th, and then again on the 12th and 13th to serve as a warm-up to the 40s after it had mostly been in the 30s for a long time before that. Then January 17th to 18th would serve as a warm-up with precipitation and temperatures going right back to the mid-40s. But January 19th would be snowy with a high of 41, and then we would see a 4-day cold wave and 6 days with highs of 33. That's the thing. There were 8 days with sub-freezing highs, but then there were 6 days with highs of exactly 33 degrees, which definitely contributed to how cold it was in 2025's January. After that, there was some signs of a warm up on the 26th through the end of the month, and there wasn't really anything too cold. But, I mean, even then, signs were limited. So January finished well below average. There was a day with a high temperature of 19 degrees. The next day had a low temperature of 10 degrees. Both days had mean temperatures averaged out to just 15 degrees, which was the coldest conditions that we saw here since February 2023 in both respects. Well, I guess in high December 2022. But 2022, 2023 was well above average, mainly because those were the fringe outlier events, and most of the rest of the month was very warm and mild. There really was no signs of mildness in any of this. I mean, honestly, it took until February, like 25th-ish, for us to finally see a low temperature in the 40s, which shouldn't be that much to ask for, and it would be April by the time we saw a low temperature in the 50s. Again, we'll go into Extreme Weather Watch and their data at another time, because I do want to wait until all of 2025 is done to do that kind of a video. February, January actually ended on a warm note. Low of 36, high of 48 in rain. So it started and ended on warm notes, even though most of it was very cold. February would sort of start on this temperature nosedive as a really roller coaster. So it'll go from 48 degrees down to 21, bottom out at 17 on February 2nd with a high of 31. That would serve as the low temperature on February 3rd, and the temperature would then slowly begin to climb up and eventually reach its peak of 49 degrees. Then the next day, February 4th, had a high of 47 and a low of either 32 or 34. Before it would start to be, back into the cold conditions. But even though it was cold, it was never extremely cold. There were some signs of warmth, but there were also some signs of coldness. I think really February 18th to 20th in that cold wave cemented February as a month that was going to be below average. I also think that even when it was warm, for a large chunk of the month, it appeared that 49 degrees might be the warmest temperature of a month, which would, be one of the coldest marks on record. It's just that there was nothing too extreme. The coldest low temperature was 17 degrees, maybe 16 to 15. The coldest high temperature, I think, was somewhere in the mid-20s. So cold, but not extreme. Nothing extreme. Then eventually February did show signs of warming up with high temperatures hitting the 50s. I think the highest all month was like 55 or something. Low temperatures finally went back into the low 40s. So eventually February showed signs of warming up. In March, to its credit, no snow. The coldest low was 20 degrees and the coldest high was 33 in one Arctic epoch on March 2nd. But by the 5th, we were back to lows in the low 40s and highs in the mid 50s. So we were all the way back. And there were some days with the occasional high in the 40s and some nights with the occasional low in the 30s. But it was warming up quickly in March. March was showing signs of spring. The temperature wound up reaching 65 degrees by March 11th. And while I don't exactly recall if there were days in the 70s, so I feel like they would have had to have been. I just can't remember them cleanly off the top of my head. Again, there were real signs of it warming up, with many days being in the upper 50s to 60s as March progressed, and low temperatures were occasionally there too. Oh wait, no, now I remember. Then the highest temperature in March actually was 82 degrees. I think it was 66 before then, but then on the 29th it jumped to 82 degrees. Of course, the low temperature wound up nosediving to 43 degrees and the next day had a low of 42 and a high of just 48 because of one of the most extreme backdoor cold fronts you'll ever see ever. What makes this even more notable is that the high temperature was just 52 degrees on March 27th, but by the 31st, temperatures would hit 73 degrees again after a low of 45 as severe storms approached. April at first looked like it was going to be a cold month. The high temperature on April 12th was just 40 degrees after a low of 36, and on April 9th, the high was 49 degrees after the low had plunged down to 31 degrees, marking the first April sub-freezing low temperature in 4 years. But the month wound up warming up significantly at the end. April 17th did have a high of just 51 degrees and a low of 44 degrees. But after that, the month really warmed up. There were only 2 more days past that point with a low temperature, even in the 40s, the 18th and the 27th. And, okay, I will need to extend my walk a little bit. And the highest temperature was 85 degrees on April 19th, but it would hit 82 degrees again on April 22nd. So there was lots of warmth to go around, not a lot of cold temperatures to go around. And that's again how April had one of the warmest. I think it had the warmest 12-day end on record, which was able to counteract the cold start. May was the opposite. There were no lows of 50 degrees or cooler. I think it was 50 degrees, but no lows in the 40s until May 20th. So it was cold at first. There was no cold at first. That's what I meant to say. There was a day on May 9th with a high of 60 and a low of 51. So there were some scattered cold conditions. There were some highs in the 60s, but nothing, too extreme. May was shaping up to be like another warm month because there was no signs of any kind of freezes. But what kept the May temperature in check was a lack of highs in the 80s, which had happened only a few times leading up to this point. So the temperature was in it for it to be below average. On the 20th, the lowest dropped to 49 degrees, but the high temperature rebounded to 67. The next 2 days, though, had highs of 59 and 51 respectively, the 51-degree reading setting a record even at Central Park, while the low temperatures were 49 and 48, and they'd be 48 the next day as the high rose to 63. May 24th would also see a low in the 40s before they would be in the low 50s. And high temperatures would, be low 70s at warmest. That pushed May below average. June started off below average too, with a low of 50 degrees, and high temperatures, only in the upper 60s. It looked like it was going to be a cold start, but it heated up right away, then cooled off, heated up. There was a period of 4 days in a row with highs in the 60s, but then immediately after that was a high of 84 and then 88. And that whole period, 8 days in a row of highs in the 80s. More extremely, however, 3 of those days had high temperatures jump into the 90s, but they were 96, 99, and 96. One of the most intense 3-day heat waves on record. The low temperatures were 80, 81, and 80. So the average high was 97 degrees, and the average low was 80.3 degrees during this 3-day heat wave. That produced a very, very intense average temperature. When you average both the highs and the lows, it was very intense because it was 88.7 degrees. That is very extreme for an average temperature. Remember, that takes into account the high and the low. So, that was that. But then on June 26th, the high is 85 degrees, but it is cooling off all day and it hit 69. The next day is a high of 72 and a low of 62, so June shows signs of moderating. But the next 3 days all have warm high temperatures. July's coolest reading all month was only 65 degrees, and it was 67 degrees before the final day of the month. There were only, I think, 7 days with lows in the 70s. Lots of days with highs in the 90s, too, as there were multiple separate bouts of heat waves. Overall, July was 2 degrees above average, and every day at a high of 80 degrees or above. Now, after that, August was 2.3 degrees below average. Started off with a high of 73 and a low of 63 degrees, so it already started off on a below average note. And then August warmed up, but then its warm moments and its cool moments as it sort of moderated in and out of stuff. August 20th to 22nd, so August having low temperatures fall to the 50s in back-to-back years, because this happened in 2024 as well. But this time it was 3 days in a row. And I think there were 4 days in a row from the 18th to 21st where high temperatures wouldn't hit 80 degrees, although on the 22nd after the low of 58, the high temperature would hit up to 83 degrees. Then, August 26th to 31st, final 6 days, had highs in the 70s, and the final 2 days had lows in the 50s on August 30th and 31st. So that's how August went. September was just most of this month where it never cooled off. The coolest temperature was 56 degrees. There's only one day with a high in the 60s in September. There were some days with highs in the with lows in the 70s, but the warmest high was, I think, mid 80s-ish. I think it was 86 degrees. So there wasn't really too much in the way of any extreme readings. It was mostly moderate, but moderate readings in September usually indicate a warmer month. October was also slightly above average. You did have 4 days in a row with highs in the 80s, and some of those days had lows in the 60s. But eventually, the lows in the 40s came by October 9th, actually. October 9th. And there just wasn't really anything to indicate either extreme warmth or extreme cold. But when you don't have those readings, and you do have that warm period at the start of the month, it does usually indicate a warmer month. But again, I was in Delaware for most of this. Same with November. Again, I just have to go based on perception of what I felt. But especially when it started to freeze a bit, it was becoming obvious that November was like this. And then since November 27th, it's been below average every single day. That's why December's been so cold, is because the warmest temperature is 47 degrees. We're not having any signs of above average weather. We're now having lows get down to the teens and highs in the upper 20s. I think today is finally going to break that streak, and we will have above average conditions. There's been very few days with sub-freezing highs, and I just don't see how it's going to change dramatically. All that stuff will put 2025 in the below average category. It's weird because there have been some extreme heat events, but when it's not, it's generally been on the colder side.